All right, everybody. Today we're going to be learning about the French Revolution. And so I wanted to give you pretty much an overview. It's a complicated time period, but it's very interesting. I'll give you this overview, and then I want you guys to go to that reading that you're assigned that will get you into more details about the Reign of Terror and kind of the middle time period of the French Revolution. And then we'll end this week with Napoleon and his rise to power and then some of the difficulties he faced, or whether they were created by himself or by the people around him. So, French Revolution. So let's start with a little historical context. So we've got the causes of the French Revolution, and some of them are more immediate to the actual revolution, and some of them have been brewing for quite a while. So one of the things I like to reference is the Glorious Revolution in England that happened in 1688 with the ascension to the throne of William and Mary, who are then going to be constitutional monarchs. Their power is going to be limited by the English Bill of Rights and by the fact that they do not have enough money, and they're essentially living on an allowance granted to them by the Parliament. So you're going to see other European countries look at England and what has been accomplished there, and then look at the absolutists that are governing their lives, and they will start to question that system and realize that there could be alternative ways to rule. You then start to see the Enlightenment developing. Late 1600s into the 1700s, you have philosophers or philosophers and intellectuals, and they are taking principles that came to them from the scientific revolution, and they are applying them not just to governmental structures, but society in general. And those new ideas are going to question the hierarchy, going to question the current systems of government, question that divine right claim to rule, and it's going to cause people to desire a different form of government, and that's going to help to start the French Revolution. Additionally, for a couple of reasons, the American Revolution is a cause to the French Revolution. Sure, it is inspiring for the French to see the Americans fight in a revolution and to be successful against the English, but it is also economically devastating because the French helped the Americans to win that revolution. So they helped and fought alongside of and gave funds to the colonists in order to fight against the British soldiers in the American Revolution. And then for them to be in debt because of all of this money being used to fight different wars is going to cause, again, instability in France. So yes, it's inspiring because look at all of these Enlightenment principles that are put into action with the American Revolution. Again, not all of them are put into action. As you see, slavery remained. Women were not allowed to vote. So there's not all total equality. And if you look at Locke's ideas of life, liberty, and property, the American Revolution just granted to certain people life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but not necessarily guaranteeing people a right to land. So yes, the American Revolution had Enlightenment ideals within it, but it was not a full embodiment of it. And the French, you could argue, maybe were more greatly impacted by the economic consequences of helping the Americans in the revolution. And that spurred on their actual revolution in their own country because their economy was so bad than necessarily just the ideas of the philosophers. Because where did those philosophers come from? The majority of philosophers working during the Enlightenment were philosophes, and they were already in France. So let's look at the more internal causes of the French Revolution versus the external causes that we just looked at, which oftentimes were more long-term. Internal causes, some of them were long-term, some of them were more immediate, but you've got economic problems. The economic problems a lot of times stem from the fact that France was broken up into what we call three estates. They also called it the ancien regime or ancient regime, which is essentially a hierarchical structure that puts the clergy at the top, the nobility in second, and everybody else in third. And just to give you an idea, you had about 97% of the population that was in the third estate. You have about 1 to 2% of the population in the second estate and 1% in the first estate. So again, I understand that that doesn't quite add up perfectly, but they're estimates. So the first estate is the clergy or the church, because the church is always on top. The second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is everybody else. Now, in that everybody else category, as we learned this past week, when we talked about the Enlightenment and you watched the Crash Course European History on the Enlightenment, a middle class was starting to develop. So people were having more economic opportunities. So they were developing some wealth. Sometimes they had opportunities at education, but then when it came to politics and government, they were still stuck in that old three estate system and they didn't have a lot of rights. So we'll talk about that. Additionally, the reason the three estate systems is under economic, and you could put the three estate system under economic and political and social as being causes of the French Revolution. But the reason it's under economic, is because of the fact that the third estate paid the majority of the taxes in France. So you would have a system where the first and second estate would vote to raise taxes on the third estate, and the third estate would, of course, cast their vote and say, don't raise taxes on us. But again, the votes were not based on population. It was always each estate got one vote. So it didn't matter that the majority of the population was in the third estate. They only had one vote, and then they always got outvoted. So the poor and this thriving new middle class paid a huge percentage of their income in taxes, whereas the nobility and the clergy were essentially tax exempt. So this becomes more and more of a problem as the debt in France is rising because of the wars that it is involved in. We'll get into the 7 Years' War, and then the French and Indian War, and then also the American Revolution, which, I mean, that's kind of like the last straw. And we know that this is coming off a time period when you had before this Louis XIV, who was very much into making war and not always at a profit. So there's a huge amount of debt, and in order to get rid of some of that debt, there's a lot of taxes that are levied on the people. Additionally, there is going to be a very bad famine that occurs the year before, or the time, like right around the year before the French Revolution, that is going to make it so people are starving. So you give people a lot of taxes, you make it so they're starving, and then you don't give them any voice in government. That is a recipe for revolution, because revolution might result in your death, but a lot of people in France were feeling like they were going to die anyway. So might as well go out in a blaze of glory. So the representation issue, or we would call this political, having to do with how are they represented in government, was a big issue that had been fought over quite often in the history of France, which is if you have these three estate system and you don't do any voting by population, then that third estate is really unrepresented for the most part, because you have 97% of the population and they have one vote. So the two wealthy classes, which would have been the clergy or the church and the nobility, would form an alliance, and they would always outvote the third estate. So that was an issue that kept coming up. The Estates General is their kind of parliament, their main parliamentary organization. And just so you know, what's interesting about this is we can complain all the time about their votes and what they were getting or not getting, but the Estates General hadn't met in 175 years. So it existed on paper, but it actually hadn't met and cast votes. Essentially, you had absolutists who were just raising taxes, and they only were raising taxes on the third estate because that was what they could get away with without having too much of a pushback. So yes, the Estates General representation was an issue, but you've got to understand that the Estates General hadn't met in 175 years, because when you have an absolutist leader, why would you need your nobility and your wealthy people to gather to vote? So it's kind of silly. So another big cause of the French Revolution was very immediate, and it was the fact that Louis XVI was not a very successful leader. And you'll watch a video about this, but there are a lot of complaints about his inability and not being prepared to lead, and definitely not being prepared to lead in a difficult time. He makes a pretty important marriage, in that he marries Marie Antoinette, who is an Austrian, to kind of make an alliance with the Austrians who had historically been kind of an enemy of the French people. But because Louis XVI is not a very good ruler, he doesn't do a good job of making Marie Antoinette feel accepted. So his wife is kind of scorned and mocked by the people as being one of those Austrians that they hated so much. And so he's got a hated wife. They don't like him. And then he continues, even in difficult economic situations, to live extravagantly in that Palace of Versailles that was built to greatness during Louis XIV's reign. He's not going to listen to the Third Estate. He's going to tax them heavily. And then you have essentially the start of the French Revolution. So that last slide was more of an overview of something I would probably give to my college prep students as causes of the French Revolution. You guys need to know some more details. So you need to know a little bit more about why France was in a financial crisis. And you need to know a little bit more about how the government and the taxes had been raised and set up prior to the actual start of the French Revolution. So I'm going to have you watch a crash course right now on the 7 Years' War and kind of take you through how that could also be a cause of the French Revolution and the financial problems that the French were experiencing. You also need to understand the idea of parliaments, which is different from parliament with an I. I and then M-A-N-T, which you would have seen in England. Parliaments are the French royal courts. They're dominated by hereditary nobility, and they're the ones, because the States General is not meeting, they're the ones that are making local tax decisions oftentimes. So they made it very difficult to tax the wealthy because they were in charge of them. They were initially abolished by Louis XV, again trying to get the nobility under control. Louis XVI, in a moment of weakness, brings the parliaments back because he's trying to get the people on his side. And for the most part, the people liked the parliaments obviously better than they liked the king. So they liked the parliaments because the nobility opposed the monarchy, and the people are like, yeah, we oppose the monarchy too. So Louis XVI, in a moment of weakness, brings them back, and they keep on making it difficult for Louis XVI to get his taxes passed that he needs, because he really does need to raise taxes on the nobility as well, because he's not getting enough money out of the poor. So eventually, Louis is going to get fed up with the fact that the parliaments are making it hard for him to accomplish what he wants. And so Louis XVI, really puts his nail in his own coffin when he demands that the Estates General that hasn't met in 175 years meets. Because at that point, then, you're getting the Third Estate involved, and the Third Estate are a bunch of people that are very hard to control. So let's watch the 7 Years' War video at this point.
My name is John Green. This is Crash Course World History. Oh my gosh! Today we're going to talk about war. Explosions everywhere! So traditionally, historians are pretty keen on wars because they feature clearly delineated beginnings and middles and ends, and because they always have a fair bit of death and drama and mortally wounded generals who have great last words like, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees." Whereas the last words of plague victims are always like, Sorry, plague victims. As if you don't have enough troubles, now you've got me teasing you about your uninspired death throes. Wars have easy whens, wheres, whos, and whys. 1861 to 1865, the United States, the North versus the South to end slavery and save the Union.
Mr. Green, are you going to show us the hidden complexities behind something we already think we understand again?
Sorry, me from the past, but yes. However, to placate you, here are some more explosions. Boom, 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 boom. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a bunch of top-notch wars, but today we're going to focus on the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian Wars, because it was the first truly global war. In fact, no less a historian than Winston Churchill called it the First World War. But we've been so Eurocentric here on Crash Course that all we are going to say about the entire war in Europe is that Prussia and Great Britain fought France and Austria, and that the Austrian Habsburgs wanted to win back Silesia, which they failed to do. There! That's all you get, Europe! So the 7 Years' War lasted for anyone? 23 years? I hate you, me from the past. But as it happens, by sheer coincidence, you are not necessarily wrong. So the when. The 7 Years' War began in 1756 and ended in 1763. Unless you believe, as many historians do, that the 7 Years' War lasted 23 years because it was really a continuation of the War for Austrian Succession. Then you have the fact that much of the information in today's episode is taken from a book called The Global 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, a 9-year period. As for the who, it was mainly fought between the British and the French, seen here reenacting the knife fight from either Beat It or West Side Story, depending on your age. But some of the British were actually Americans, and both the British and the French were supported by American Indians. And there was fighting in India between Indian Indians, the British, and the French. And as previously noted, the French were fighting the Prussians and the British were fighting the Austrians. The where, Europe, the continental US, the Caribbean Sea, off the coast of Africa, India, basically the world. And the why? Ostensibly land. British colonists wanted to expand into land west of the original 13 colonies. And that land was technically held by the French, who left it alone except for a bunch of trading posts, and they were like, "Je ne veux pas l'anglais!" Thank you, 4 years of high school French. Anyway, the war wasn't really about land. It was really about our old friend, trade. The British wanted to expand into the American interior to allow for more colonists, because the British benefited both from the export of raw materials from the Americas and the import of British consumer goods to the Americas. So more colonists meant more trade, which meant more wealth, which meant ever fancier hats. And the French realized that this British Atlantic maritime trade was making Britain so rich that Britain might come for France's actually valuable colonies, which were not in the continental US, but those slave-based sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So the fighting began around here, and while the British did send over actual British troops, much of the early fighting was done by colonial militias. Probably the most famous commander of British troops was a Virginia colonel named George Washington. In fact, he may have actually started the shooting at the Battle of Fort Necessity in May of 1754. Washington was captured in that battle, but then he was immediately released because 18th century war was super weird. Anyway, the real North American action was in New York and Canada. At the Battle at the Plains of Abraham in 1759, for instance, the British defeated the French and captured the city of Quebec. Both the British commander General Wolfe and the French commander General Montcalm were killed in that battle, with the death of the former being immortalized in this famous painting by Benjamin West. As indicated by the picture, almost all the battles in North America featured significant participation by Native Americans. Different native tribes sided with both the British and the French, but as a broad generalization, Native Americans were more likely to support the French. Up to this point, shrewd Indian tribes had been able to play the British and the French off each other and maintain a degree of autonomy for themselves. And as long as the French were present, the British were prevented from encroaching too much on lands Native Americans were using for hunting and agriculture. Now, we haven't talked much about American Indians, mostly because they were geographically isolated and didn't have a written language, but let's at least give them a thought bubble. Before the arrival of the Europeans, most Native Americans lived in tribal groups, and they subsisted on a combination of small-scale agriculture and hunting and gathering, depending on where they were situated. There were too many tribes to generalize about specific social structures, but it's probably safe to say that in terms of gender, they were much more egalitarian than the Europeans who they met up with, which may explain why European women who were taken captive by Indians sometimes preferred to stay with the tribe rather than be rescued, although that's somewhat controversial. One thing we can say about the Indians, their notions of what it meant to hold property were very different from those of the Europeans. Individual Indians did not own land in the European sense. They used it, and not always particularly intensively. Europeans, when they came to North America, had a hard time even recognizing crops because their forms of farming were so different from European agriculture. So the French, and especially the English, just assumed that the Indians weren't improving the land, which meant that they didn't own the land, so that meant that it was okay for Europeans to take it. As you might imagine, that was problematic for the Indians. In general, Indian tribes initially got along better with the French than with the Dutch or English because, one, the French did not settle in large numbers as they were mostly traders and fur trappers, and two, French missionaries who made the journey to the Americas were Catholic, often Jesuits, who were so intent on converting the Indians that they took the time to learn Indian languages and try to make Catholicism more amenable to Indian religion. The end result of the war, a greatly reduced French presence on the American mainland, meant that Indians could no longer easily play the British and French off each other, which opened the floodgates of British settlers. In the end, the American Indians were perhaps the biggest losers of the 7 Years' War. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So 2,000 miles south in the Caribbean, there was also quite a lot of fighting between the British and the French over sugar colonies. Most of these were naval battles, and by 1761, Spain got involved because, they had some sugar colonies of their own. While these battles get a lot of ink, it's interesting to note that by far the greatest threat to combatants was disease. By October of 1761, the British had lost about 1,000 men to war and 5,000 to disease. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the British and the French were fighting there too, because, why not? The British attacked the French at a trading post called St. Louis. Oh, Stan, don't make me say it right. Fine. Saint Louis, and at a town called Gorée, both in Senegal. Why? Well, trade, of course. Senegal was the main source of gum arabic, which is notable for many reasons, but most importantly, it is a key ingredient in the Diet Coke and Mentos phenomenon, so of course the British wanted lots of it. And the French were also fighting the British in India. In the 18th century, India was nominally ruled by the Mughal Empire. I bet I'm saying that wrong, aren't I? Mughal. Yeah, that sounds more plausible. But as throughout most of its history, the real power in India lay with local kings and princes, sometimes called nawabs. And these princes, just like their European counterparts, were constantly vying for power and control over more territory. And to get it, they often enlisted the help, especially the military help, of Europeans. This is what happened in the most notorious event in the 7 Years' War in India, the Black Hole of Calcutta. In June of 1756, the British governor of Calcutta, Roger Drake, made the mistake of insulting the emissaries sent by the Nawab Siraj ad-Dowlah, who duly besieged and captured the English garrison of 500 with his own army of 30,000. Drake escaped to nearby ships with the town's women and children. You know the old saying, women, children, and governors first. But the town's defenders remained, and the survivors were imprisoned in a small windowless room that came to be known as the Black Hole, and 40 of 63 prisoners suffocated overnight. This story is mostly famous in a war that killed 1 million people because the British press exaggerated the numbers in order to build support for the war in India. Not the last time that exaggerations of enemy brutality would be used to gin up support for a war. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the military campaigns in this part of the world is that, at least initially, they were not undertaken by governments themselves, but by corporations that had their own armies. The British East India Company was the most successful of these corporations, primarily because of the military skill of its leader, Robert Clive. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Robert Clive. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, bubbles. That makes sense, Stan. The British East India Company was involved in several early market bubbles. Bubbles. Dear Robert Clive, you were a complicated man and not entirely likable, but you did win a very important battle at Plassey in 1757. And the way you won it says a lot about the relationship between Europe and its colonies. So the key to your success was a conspiracy to overthrow the existing Nawab, orchestrated by a Bengali banking family called the Seths. No, Stan, the Seths. Yes. Come on. And in thanks for your support of their conspiracy, the new Nawab quickly signed a treaty with your company, the East India Company. And thereafter, the British had effective control over trade in Bengal, and the French were excluded from it. This was an incredibly valuable region because it produced silk and inexpensive cotton cloth for export, and it gave the British a decisive advantage over the French and eventually allowed them to control all of India. And you accomplished this, Robert Clive, primarily by fomenting revolution. Why does this work for you and it never works for the CIA? Best wishes, John Green. So by now you've probably figured out that since the French kept losing battles, they eventually lost the war. The main peace treaty signed in Paris in 1763 limited French presence in the Caribbean, in India, and in North America. Although not completely, otherwise they couldn't have sold Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson in 1803. So France was obviously dramatically weakened, but overall, so was Britain. One thing rarely mentioned is the actual human cost of war. As many as 1 million combatants died in the 7 Years' War, but even that doesn't tell the whole story. In the 18th century, armies usually fed themselves by foraging, which really meant just pillaging the countryside. In Europe, a single Prussian province lost 1/5 of its population to pillaging, and in North America, settlers in frontier regions lived in constant fear of raids. And one of the perhaps lesser-known outcomes of the war was the systematic deportation of French Acadians from Maine to Louisiana, where they became Cajuns, meaning that the stars of the television shows Lobster Wars and Swamp Wars are basically the same people. What's that? There's no television show called Swamp Wars? Stan, cancel everything and get me on the phone with the Discovery Channel. One last thing about wars, they are expensive. In 1756, the British national debt was £75 million. In 1763, it was £133 million. Someone had to pay for this, and the British felt it was only fair that the American colonists should foot the bill. And those taxes, which helped fuel the American Revolution, were a direct result of the 7 Years' War. So in one way, winning the 7 Years' War cost Britain its first empire. But when we remember that it was a global war, and especially when we think about what happened in India, then the 7 Years' War also begins to look like the beginning of Britain's second and much greater empire. Winning is losing, is winning is losing. Such is life, and such is history. Thanks for watching. See you next week.
So just to continue on with these financial problems that France was experiencing. Here you obviously have the Palace of Versailles, home to Louis the 16th, and the extravagance that was displayed there. It was expensive to run. It was like a city, but I think even more than that, it represented the fact that the monarchy had lost touch with the people and their concerns and their difficulties. You add that to the financial crisis as a result of the wars the French had been involved in, as well as the inability for taxes to be raised on the nobility, which is making it hard to get the debt under control and means that the taxes are still mainly falling on the poor third estate to pay. And then you add in these Enlightenment ideas that we talked about last week of there's got to be a better way, and people questioning. You start to get a perfect recipe for disaster in France, or what could be, if you don't want to look at it that way, for opportunity in France for them to actually try a different form of government. And they will try many different forms of government. So one of the things that is produced prior to the actual start of the French Revolution is a list of what they call cahiers de doléances. Cahiers means complaints. So all different groups, the first estate, the second estate, the third estate, they all had complaints. And they created these cahiers, or these lists of grievances that were produced, printed, passed around, and is eventually, presented to the king. And these were problems that they saw that they wanted changed in order to improve France. Pretty much all of the estates agreed that the government was wasting money, that there were too many indirect taxes, maybe through tariffs on certain products that made it so that the French had to pay extra for something because they had to essentially pay that tax coming into the country in addition to actually paying their taxes on a regular basis. They also paid a tithe to the church that was required, so it became like a church tax. And there was lots of corruption. So the cahiers in general wanted a more equitable tax situation. Even the nobility understood that at some point they needed to pay some taxes, but they didn't want to pay taxes that were just going to go to waste. They also wanted more opportunities to have better trade practices, kind of get rid of some of those mercantilistic activities. And they really wanted a free press and the ability to freely critique the leadership of their country. So the Third Estate is actually going to have a victory in December of 1788 when the Royal Council announces that the Third Estate is going to get one of its main complaints about representation, which is that they didn't have representation that was equal to their population. They still won't have representation that's equal to their population, but they were going to get twice as many representatives to their estate as the other two estates. So they would have a chance to at least essentially tie the vote. Liberal nobles and clergy supported this move because they thought it made it fairer, and a lot of these people were involved in the Enlightenment and saw some of those ideas as being necessary to maintain their country. However, the problem is that this method of voting had not been officially decided. It had been announced but hadn't been actually used yet, and because the Estates General had not been gathered yet. So it's not until Louis XVI actually calls the Estates General that there's going to be an opportunity for this new type of voting system. So this is back to a slide that I would use with my college prep students, but just to give you kind of a holistic view of what we're seeing here. You've got some long-term causes, and the long and short-term can kind of blend at points because representation of the three estates, as you see as a short-term cause here, has been an issue for a very long time. I might actually even change these for you guys because I think you better understand it this way and is more accurate, to say external causes versus internal causes. The external causes being some of the new Enlightenment ideas. Some of them were internal because you had philosophers from France, but mostly activities going on throughout Europe. And then the short-term causes being stuff that's going on directly within the country. So what's going to happen with the start of the French Revolution is you're going to have the Estates General meet. You're going to have the Third Estate not be happy and decide to walk out because they want a constitution. They want to redo some major laws. And so they're going to walk out, And then Louis the 16th is going to respond with his great, well, I'm going to lock the doors to their meeting room, and if they can't meet, then they can't get angry, right? And of course, the Third Estate says, I think we can still meet. They go to a tennis court. It's an indoor tennis court. They meet and they take a tennis court oath, which essentially says that they will continue to meet until they have a new constitution. And they are going to sign a Declaration of the Rights of Man, which essentially makes it so that the king is more controlled, like you would see in England with the English Bill of Rights. So one of the things you want to just be aware of is that Louis XVI is going to see these things happening, and he's going to realize that he's got a problem, and so he's going to tell the First and Second Estate to go to the tennis court and meet with the Third Estate to try to get some resolution. The violence breaks out after that as people start to get really frustrated and think that maybe the king is trying to gather some troops to come and stop this thing. And so they storm the Bastille, and trying to collect gunpowder and some weapons. And also it was symbolic of getting rid of the king's power, in that he threw people in the Bastille who were political prisoners who went against his authority. So for you guys, here's the details. The National Assembly is what this group will now call themselves, that are meeting on the tennis court. They will include Third Estate and Second Estate members, as well as some First Estate, more liberal clergy members, and they will officially call themselves the National Assembly on June 17, 1789. Like I said before, the National Assembly will gather at the indoor tennis court. They're going to draft a new constitution. Louis XVI at one point is going to go, okay, I give up, and force the First and Second Estate that had yet to join to go ahead and meet with the National Assembly. At that point, they'll rename themselves the National Constituent Assembly. You don't really need to know that detail. And it's composed of all three estates. And they share administrative, constitutional, and economic reform goals for the country. So just a quick timeline of some major things related to this. So from the winter and spring of 1788 to 1789, there had been some really high bread prices because of food shortages and a really bad winter. On July 11th of 1789, Louis XVI had dismissed a well-loved finance minister named Jacques Necker. There had been some problems, and they were trying to figure out how to raise taxes, and we talked about this already. So July 14th is that big day, the storming of the Bastille. They still celebrate this day every year in France in 1789. They're looking for arms to support their militia, and you have 98 Parisians, or people from Paris, and several troops and the governor of the Bastille that are killed. July 15th, 1789, the National Guard, led by Lafayette, officially will take over the Bastille, and Louis XVI days later recognizes this new government and National Assembly and goes, I get it, I'm losing right now. So there's something called the Great Fear that occurs, where peasants start to sense this new growing revolutionary trend, and so what they will do is they will rise up in the countryside and attack the landowners and take over their properties, and people are killed. Also, August 4th of 1789, several nobles and clergymen are going to renounce their nobility rights in the new National Assembly to kind of stop the riots and say, hey, we're on your side, we shouldn't have these special rights. In 1789, they'll officially abolish what's the old regime and that three estates system. This is all happening very quickly during the summer of 1789, but by August 27, 1789, you're going to have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's very similar to the United States' Declaration of Independence. It proclaims liberty, freedom, and natural rights. And just two of the most powerful ideas of civic equality and popular sovereignty are included in there. So the idea of the people being what constitutes the country, and that everybody should have equal standing before the government and the law is in this document. Women are not included in this document, and that's why we talk about later with Olympia de Gouges. She'll write a Declaration of the Rights of Woman, and she will eventually get her head chopped off. Women are going to be very active in the first stages of the French Revolution. There's a lot of anger over the prices of bread, and women are going to gather at the Palace of Versailles, which is about 15 miles outside of Paris, and they are going to, on October 5th, 1789, they are going to storm that palace, and they are going to, essentially they thought grain had been stored there, and they were going to go there to get the bread. What ends up happening is these women, along with some other revolutionary soldiers and militia, are going to force the king and his wife to go back to Paris and to stay in the Tuileries Palace, so that the people of Paris can keep an eye on them, so they're not kind of in their country estate. So by 1791, you'll have the Legislative Assembly, or the National Assembly, is becoming the main law body-making power. The monarch will be having limited powers at this point. They're pretty much under house arrest in Paris. Only active citizens, or those paying annual taxes in this new setup, are going to be able to vote. So it doesn't give everybody voting rights, but it's definitely voting rights that are expanded because before it was essentially an absolutist monarchy. So it mentions here Olympia de Gouges will then compose the Declaration of the Rights of Women, using the Men's Declaration to call for women to be treated the same. By 1790, just to get an idea, equality is so important in France. Their motto is liberty, equality, fraternity. Equality was so important that they actually redivided up the French city-town system in order to do representation, and they wanted them all to be equally sized administrative units. That doesn't necessarily always deal with population, but this idea of equality and having things equal is very important to the French people during this time. So here you can see a map of France in 1789, and you have a lot of areas in the south here that are larger, and this was how you had representation in the National Assembly. Well, they're going to change this, and it's going to look like this. So you can see all of these areas are very set up equally, trying to make them equal sizes so that everybody has representation in government. So then at this point, you've got your laws in place, you've got your Constitution, you've got your Bill of Rights, and so now they're going to start looking at changing economically the laws to make it more friendly for some of the trade things that they wanted to happen. So they're going to actually ban workers' organizations like guilds and unions, so that there is an easier access to products that are being made, and you don't have to go through kind of that guild system, which maybe artificially raises prices. Land belonging to the Roman Catholic Church is going to be confiscated, and there's a lot of it in France, and sold. This will create problems because it's actually going to anger not just the Roman Catholic Church, but also the Catholic people who are very attached to their faith. So you're going to have civil wars break out essentially within France at the same time that in a few slides you're going to find out that France is also going to get attacked by Austria and by England, and they're going to be at war outside, and they're also going to have a civil war going on in their country. They will have a problem with inflation because as the Catholic Church, all this money comes into the population, the money starts to become worth less. And so they're going to have government bonds that they use or create as a result of settling church property. They use it as currency. They're called assignats, but those are going to lose value as well as inflation, as a whole bunch of money floods the country. Socially, you're going to see some changes with the Catholic Church, right? They've already got their land taken away. You're going to have in July of 1790 a document called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy that is created. It's going to make the Roman Catholic Church controlled by the secular state. It's going to make the church and state relations really bad, and it's also going to be condemned by the Pope during this time period. And the Pope during this time period also condemns the Declaration of the Rights of Man as going against church teaching. So as we said, there starts to be civil war and a lot of tension within the country as some people think that now some of the revolutionary activity has gone too far. You're going to have nobility that are going to leave. They're going to escape. Most of them go to England to kind of sit out this revolution and hope for the best. They're called émigrés. And then what you're going to have is King Louis XVI is going to attempt to flee France. He's going to take his Austrian wife, and they're going to try to make it towards, get out of France, go towards some areas controlled by the Austrian Habsburgs in hopes of being taken care of there, and that Austria would then help Louis to fight to get his throne back. This is not successful because King Louis XVI is captured before he gets out of France. At this point, you're going to have some declarations by the Austrian emperor and the king of Prussia, both saying that they'll essentially come together and intervene to protect the monarchy in France if they get some more help. And eventually England will get involved to help them, because it is very important during this time period for these monarchs all believing that if one of them falls, they all fall. So their concern was to protect each other and the idea of monarchy. So I don't think I mentioned it now, but I will mention it already, but I will mention that a lot of Catholics, very devout Catholics in the countryside, thought that the French Revolution was a city thing, and that those crazy city folk were out of control with their Enlightenment ideas, and that they had gone way too far. And so you had this guy, he's in the bathtub here on the left because he had some physical ailments. His name was Marat, and the painter's name is David. That's why you see David at the bottom of the little table that's there. But Marat was known as the voice of the people. He wrote in a newspaper condemning anybody who was against the revolution and against this new government that's coming into power. And so you have a lady on the right, her name is Charlotte Corday. She is from the countryside. She is a very devout Catholic, and she takes it upon herself, knowing that she will be killed, to go and execute Marat, because she believes that he is the one that is causing people to riot and to make all of these extreme changes that are hurting the Catholic Church. So originally, when this revolution started, the goal had been for a constitutional monarchy, similar probably to what you had seen in England in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. But as people start to experience power and these Enlightenment ideas start to get traction, you have more extremists that rise up within the National Assembly, and they want to take it farther than just having a constitutional monarchy. And now that you have your king essentially having tried to escape the country and to essentially get outside countries to attack France, they feel like they can no longer have this kind of monarch in charge. So you have groups like the Jacobins, and they were people that wanted a republic, not just a monarchy. So they wanted something more like what was happening in the United States. So one group within the Jacobins is the Girondins. They are the more moderate of the group of Jacobins, and they're going to assume leadership in the National Assembly. They will declare war on Austria because Austria is going to declare war on them. And they will force Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette into imprisonment. And eventually they will put them on trial. So as war with Austria is beginning, people are in a lot of fear in Paris that there is going to be problems within the country with people who do not like the revolution, who are going to come together with those from Austria invading their country, and they're going to have big issues occurring. So they wanted to make sure that the people within the country of France who were against the revolution were taken care of, is what I would say. So in September of 1792, there is something called the September Massacres. And those massacres, 1,200 people are murdered in prisons by Parisians. And these people were in prison because they had been arrested for being counter-revolutionaries. And so they were executed without trial by people who, like essentially masses of people who stormed the prisons and just, chop them up. So at this point, in September 21st, 1792, you're going to have the National Assembly or the National Legislative Assembly call for universal male suffrage. That means that all men could vote instead of having to require that they have a certain amount of land. But they want to reassert that France is going to remain a monarchy. Well, at this point in the Jacobins, you're going to have more extremists than the Giordans that are going to start to rise up, and they called themselves the Sans-Culottes. Their name comes from the fact that they wore long trousers and looked and dressed like working people. They're going to start to lead a more radical form of revolution against the Giordans. They are against monarchy, they want a republican form of government, and they want people to make all the decisions. So eventually the Jacobins will start to cooperate with the Sans-Culottes, and they will get together and put Louis XVI on trial. And by January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI is executed. This is a political cartoon that is in your reader. It is a very difficult one to look at. It was created by it was created by an Englishman who was reflecting on the atrocities of the French Revolution, and these specifically are depicting the sans-culottes, yet they're exaggerating it because sans-culotte meant not to wear the culottes, but they did wear long pants. But here they essentially depict these revolutionaries without pants at all, and they make them out to be cannibals. Like, they're so into revolution that they're eating their own people. And so dead people everywhere, bones and things hanging. You can kind of see in the outside of the window that there are heads there. Everybody's decapitated. And they're roasting babies and that kind of thing. So this idea that the English thought the sans-culottes and really the French Revolution had entered a dangerous and more extreme stage. So then we get the Reign of Terror. So in 1793, after the radicals execute the king, the National Assembly is dissolved, and you have something called the National Convention created, which in France will be declared a republic. And then starting in the summer of 1793, you're going to have a gentleman by the name of Robespierre, who had been a Jacobin, who is going to come to power along with some of his friends, and they are going to set up something called the Committee of Public Safety. And that committee was supposed to protect the republic and its gains and ideals from internal enemies. And that required that they seek out and find anybody who may have thought that the revolution had gone too far and arrest them and put them on trial and then execute them. Now, it was really important, Robespierre thought, to do this because at the same time that they're dealing with internal enemies of people not being happy about this new republic, they were still fighting a war against Austria and Prussia and England. So they've got lots going on. And so it's called the Reign of Terror when, again, you have the extremists going and deciding that anybody who is not fully supportive of this new republic, anyone who's not fully supportive of the sans-culottes and their ideas, needs to be killed. And I think that gets you back to that image before here, which is the idea that they got so extreme that anybody who didn't fit into their bill, they would have executed. So you'll be reading about the Reign of Terror and getting into more details about that, and then the rise of Napoleon. But that kind of takes you through the basic structure. Hopefully, once you listen to this and you watch the video about the French Revolution, you'll get a good idea of how this revolution started and how it ended. But what I would say in general that you need to know is you need to know that the French Revolution started off as a goal to limit the power of the king. There's a constitution that's created, a Declaration of Rights of Man. There's a lot of stuff that happens right in the summer of 1789 that makes a lot of improvements for people. But then it starts to take a more radical turn. The people get frustrated and fed up with their king. A lot of people no longer want a king, and you move to a republic. And when you get to that republic, there's also a move to, as that's happening, to get rid of the Catholic Church, which starts an internal civil war. And then you've got the war going on with other major powers in Europe who are trying to protect the idea of a monarchy because they think if one monarch falls on the continent, all of them are going to lose their power.